Good evening, and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. Find us on the internet at commonwealthclub.org. I am Jerry Lubenow, former director of the Center on Politics at the UC Berkeley, and currently managing editor of the California Journal of Politics and Policy at the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley, and I will moderate tonight's program. It is now my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Darrell Steinberg, President Pro Tem of the California State Senate. Darrell Steinberg worked as an employee rights attorney and an administrative law judge before finding his true calling when he ran for the Sacramento City Council in 1992. He went on to serve in the California Assembly, where he earned a number of awards, including the California Journal's Mini Award, which recognizes legislators who represent, quote, a pattern of conduct and outlook and demeanor that exemplifies the best kind of public service. In 2004, that same nonpartisan magazine named him Assembly Member of the Year and honored him as the Assembly's top member in the categories of integrity, best problem solver, and hardest working. I was fortunate to get to know Darrell during a brief break in his legislative service when he volunteered time from a very busy schedule to teach an undergraduate course on California politics at Berkeley. In 2006, he was elected to the California Senate, and in 2008, his Senate colleagues elected him to lead them as President Pro Tem. As an Assembly member, Steinberg passed the first significant expansion of community health, mental health programs in more than a decade, expanded after-school programs, and cracked down on illegal firearm trafficking. As a senator, he passed nationally recognized legislation to reduce carbon emissions from automobiles through smart planning, made public schools accountable for dropouts, and ensured foster and adopted children can get mental health services. But he's found legislating in the current gridlocked state Senate a bit more of a challenge. He presided over passage of the most ambitious renewable energy bill in the country, only to have the governor veto it. And he is currently engaged in a very difficult battle to broker one of the West's most ambitious water delivery programs. Ladies and gentlemen, Darrell Steinberg.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Jerry, for the kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me here to the Commonwealth Club tonight to talk about California and California gridlock. And I was thinking as I was listening to your pre-introduction prior to actually banging the gavel here as you were talking about the upcoming programs, including places that travelers should avoid. Sacramento. Not really. It really is very important for me to get out throughout California to talk to real people. I have found in my short tenure as president of the Senate that one of the easiest pitfalls is to get insulated and isolated, because the work itself is so intense, the problems are so daunting, and frankly, the management of an institution is a job in and of itself, that sometimes what gets lost for me is the connection with the real people. And I remind children who come to the Capitol all of the time when I ask the proverbial question, so who do I work for? And all the hands shoot up and they say, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I say, no, who do I work for? And finally they come around to the correct answer, which is I work for you. And I work for you too. And I'm anxious to share a few thoughts and then to get to some questions and answers. Let me begin, though, with this. I love political cliches. A chicken in every pot. It's important when you're running in an election, whether you're ahead or behind, to always run from behind. And then, of course, there was that famous United States president who said, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. Well, I have two of my own favorite political cliches, which are not as well known, but for me, speak to California and the great challenges we face. Number one, there are two kinds of people in politics: the short-timers and the long-termers. And number two, the process is not the problem is the problem. And let me explain what I mean, because I think a lot about both of my cliches, and they've been especially instructive to me as I have lived through and survived, and the state has survived, my first year as the Senate pro tem. Now, I was elected back by my colleagues back in March of 2008, February of 2008. But I took office in December of 2008. I'm now going on my 11th month as pro tem. And some say, only half-jokingly, that I drew the short straw, because in my first 10 months, we have addressed the single largest budget deficit in the state's history. Over $60 billion of deficit reduction from a base budget back in 2004 that was just over $100 billion. California, of course, has felt the effects of the national and international economic recession to a degree greater than any other state in the country because of our size, because of the complexity of our state. In addition to the deficit, and I would argue in large part because of the economy and the deficit, there is a huge crisis of confidence that is reflected in every public opinion poll that we read. I mean, I don't like to admit the fact that we're at 13%. You know, as I like to say, at least we're not in single digits. So there's but seriously, it's embarrassing. And it doesn't reflect the institution that I know and love, but it is the reality that we face and the challenge that we must take on to change. We also know that we are living with a political and a finance system in California, which everyone agrees falls way short in meeting the needs of Californians. And it's not just California, because there is a growing belief that democracy itself, not just in California, but in the country, is incapable of achieving major change. I don't believe it, but I think a lot of people do. And in part, that's because there has evolved a coarseness in our politics, which I think goes beyond anything that we have seen before, whether it's the 24-hour news cycle, the fact that people get paid a lot of money to share their punditry, and it encourages, I think, a debasement of our politics in a way that is not healthy. And if you're going to be reflective yourself as a public official or as a citizen of this great state, you have to admit that there is truth in every critique. And that's why all of the energy and the talk around reform, whether it's a constitutional convention or California Forward, we have the opportunity, given the fact that we have hit bottom, to fix our outdated tax system, to move to a 2-year budget and reduce the number of bills, many serious but some not needed here in California, and to move forward in a way that makes things better and restores the public confidence that currently does not exist. And yet, as we talk about reform and all that is broken about the system, when I say the process is not always the problem is the problem, I think back to what the average Californian would say about the Pat Brown era. The Pat Brown era, often regarded as the great era of achievement in California, where everything was possible, where government worked, where we built, where partisanship was more of the exception than the rule. But people don't look back at the Pat Brown era and say, this was the era of great reform. What people say is that this was an era of producing real results for Californians. The California Water Project, the Master Plan for Higher Education, the state highway system. Tangible achievements that created jobs, high-wage jobs, sustained a tax base, and gave people the confidence that government, with all of its systemic and human imperfections, was all in all a force for good. And none of these advances, by the way, were accomplished overnight. They weren't accomplished in a year, they weren't accomplished in 2 years, or even 3 years. And I think back on that period as an amateur historian, but as a student of the political process myself, and I believe that what sometimes gets lost in the broken system debate is the lost art of legislating itself. Under any system of democratic government, there will always be checks and balances, a system purposely designed to slow change. Read the Madison and Jefferson debates in the Federalist Papers. And outside special interests that have always and will always have some degree of influence over the system because we pride ourselves on the freedom of association, freedom of speech, and the freedom to express ourselves in any and every way. So let's accept those imperfections. The old Winston Churchill line that democracy is the worst form of government, with the exception of every other form of government. And let's say, okay, now what do? We fix what we know is broken, and we take advantage of the opportunities that are before us to achieve and show the people of California that we can actually solve the big, unsolvable problems. We have an unprecedented opportunity over the next several weeks to make a 30-year advance to upgrade California's water infrastructure, and I want to talk about that in a moment. We have the opportunity to make California the national leader on renewable energy and take a dramatic turn to change the course of high poverty schools in our state and begin to chip away at the broad-based fiscal and governance reforms which California Forward and Constitutional Convention advocates are rightfully pushing. So I'm not naive. I've been knocked on my butt a number of times. I've won, I've lost. And so why do I maintain a strong faith that all is not lost, despite a year that I must tell you, in my 15 years of public service, is the first year I can honestly say I have not enjoyed. Because the decisions have been negative. I take pride in the fact that the state is standing and that we did not collapse economically, even though there was every possibility that that could occur, especially if we didn't find a way to solve the budget problem. But it was no fun cutting education, health and human services, assistance to local government, and all of the other decisions that we made. But I maintain the strong faith that all is not lost because I have seen the system work. I was involved in and witnessed the possibility of transformational politics with the passage of Senate Bill 375 just a little over a year ago. This is the measure that Jerry mentioned in his introduction, where for the first time not only in California but in the country, we have brought together the issues of climate change, transportation, land use policy, and housing. And what we essentially did was we said that communities will only get major transportation funding in the future if they have a land use plan that reduces the carbon footprint and that makes development more compact. Because even if we don't change our way as a car culture, we at least need to make sure that we develop our communities in the future in a way that ensures that people are in their cars for a shorter amount of time than a longer period of time. We have to do that because we have a mandate to improve our climate. But we also know that people are commuting from Tracy to the Bay Area and are in their cars for 3 or 4 hours. What kind of a life is that when you have a family and you're trying to balance your life between work and family? The substance and the policy implications of the measure are worth an entire speech itself, but I won't use my time here to do that. But it's the political lesson which is more interesting to me, because SB 375, which I witnessed and again was a part of, is really a lesson in old-fashioned coalition building, which did not happen overnight. The genesis for me went back a decade. When I was in the Assembly in 2002, I introduced a bill, AB 680, which suggested that cities and counties in this state ought to share their sales tax as a way to reduce the incentive to locate the target on my side of the border instead of your side of the border. To end the insidious practice of basing land use decisions on who's going to get all the money from locating the auto mall or the great retail giant. And I thought it was a pretty good idea. But I swear, I had everybody opposed. Builders, local governments, housing advocates, and environmental advocates were sort of in favor, but nobody really got it. And I swear my picture was on the post office of most cities in this state. But I persevered, and in the end, we didn't get the bill. Lost. Moved it far, but in the end, the cities and the builders ended up killing the measure. Fast forward, 2006, the legislature passes and Governor Schwarzenegger signs AB 32, California's landmark climate change legislation, which says we have to dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the state through a variety of options: transportation, alternative fuels, alternative vehicles, public transportation, and better land use policies. And so SB 375 represented an opportunity to end decades of combat among powerful combatants and allow them to agree on at least one major approach to growth and environmental policy in California. The environmental community got a clear public policy victory tying transportation funding to more compact urban footprint. The builders got a more efficient and expedited process to approve development within that compact footprint. The cities got relief from litigation from housing advocates who claimed they weren't building enough affordable housing, and the affordable housing advocates got an easier process to locate affordable housing within our communities. And it was a minor miracle that those folks came together, but the time was right, and the seeds were planted in the years before. And so now we get to water. And in Contra Costa County in the Bay Area, there's a lot of controversy about water. And let me sum it up. I'll tell you all the itty-bitty details. Not really. I'll say this. Here's the problem and the challenge with water. California has more people, less water, a broken delta, which is the key to conveying water to 2/3 of Californians, and not just Southern Californians, Northern Californians as well. And those communities or areas of the state that have all the water that they need don't want to even open a little door to the possibility of changing water allocations, understandably. But we have to do something, because if we don't and the delta collapses because of the levees that are in disrepair, or because of the potential of a flood or an earthquake, every Californian is going to have to pay huge amounts to fix that problem, and or be stuck with draconian measures to reduce water usage. And so even though politically it seems next to impossible to actually bring the warring stakeholders who say, we don't want to build an alternative conveyance around the Delta. We don't want to give up any of our water. We don't want to conserve, or we don't want the state to tell us that we have to conserve. We don't want to spend the money either as taxpayers or as, oops, there goes the water. There goes, or as beneficiaries to pay for the upgraded infrastructure that we need. I am stubborn enough to not give up and to say, along with the other legislative leaders and the governor, we have got to find a way to compromise here. And over the next week or two, it is my hope and frankly my expectation that we are going to have a big breakthrough. So in conclusion, before we have a conversation, I want to say that I've been very lucky myself in terms of my public service. I served 6 years on a city council in Sacramento. I then served 6 years in the assembly before I termed out. And the honest truth of the matter is it took me 5 years to learn the job. And then I termed out of office. You know, it's another real problem with California and its governance. I mean, you think about it. If you needed to have life-saving surgery and the expert surgeon said, I'm sorry, I'm the one with the expertise, but because of the law, I have to turn this procedure over to my intern, who's dedicated, hardworking, cares a lot, but hasn't done this before. You would say, what are you talking about? It's the same thing with our government. It's the same thing with our government. But I was lucky because I sat out for 2 years, and then I was fortunate enough to get elected by the good people of Sacramento to the state Senate. And I've been able to use that experience to pick up where I left off. And I know that this system needs radical change because you can't be a long-termer if members and leaders are shuttling in and out. And there's no question that our system of public finance, the 2/3 vote, the initiative process, the legislative schedule, which is focused on a bill factory as opposed to overseeing the implementation of the laws that we've already passed, all of this must be changed. Because for every story about SB 375, there are too many things that don't get done or don't get done right. And so the last cliche, the longest race begins with the first stride. And I'm hopeful that over the next year and years, that as I look back on my tenure, that I can say that we began to turn it around. We began to restore the confidence, and that California is on a better path than it is today. Thank you very much. Look forward to your questions.
Our thanks to Darrell Steinberg, President Pro Tem of the California State Senate, for his comments this evening. Senator Steinberg, we have a number of questions, and we might as well get right to them. There were a large number of questions relating to the Constitutional Convention, and maybe what we'll try to do is sort of walk through that and the issues that are involved in it. First, there were a number of questions relating to your position. Do you think it's a good idea? Are you for it? And what do you think of the likelihood that there will be one?
I view the Constitutional Convention as a last resort. I think that it is a very important stalking horse at this point. The people who are involved, the Bay Area Council and others, are great folk who care about this state, and I think they are right to get out there and suggest the possibility of a convention, but as I say, my opinion, as a last resort. Because here's the problem with the convention. The way that it works, or that it would work, is first you have to go to the ballot to get the formation of a convention approved. And then the delegates, who would be randomly selected citizens of this state, would then gather in such a convention. The assumption would be that they would be able to break through some of the partisan and institutional differences more easily than the elected legislature, which might be true. And then whatever they came up with would then have to go back to the people for an up or down vote. None of the while sort of necessarily working with some of the larger institutional interests that have the ability. See, everybody in this current system has the ability to stop anything, right? The hard thing is making something happen. And so I worry that as a first resort, it creates a huge expectation that can't necessarily be delivered. There's another option, and then there's a third option. The other option, which I think also doesn't lead to success, unfortunately, would be for the legislature itself to wholesale put a plan of reform on the ballot for the people to consider. And you might ask, well, why? You're in charge. Why don't you think that can happen? And here's the irony of our system. It requires a 2/3 vote to put a measure on the ballot changing the 2/3 vote. It takes a 2/3 vote to put any form of constitutional change on the ballot. And I'm not saying it's impossible. And allow me to be partisan for just a moment, but one of the great frustrations as a Democrat here is that I sit at the table and I am willing, against my own interest and the things that I believe, to make difficult and painful cuts. And I've taken a lot of heat for it. But I don't see my colleagues on the other side, who we need because of the 2/3 vote, willing to consider a balanced approach that includes revenue to mitigate those cuts. And yet they have the power and the authority to stop us from even putting the suggestion of constitutional change on the ballot. Not impossible, but complicated. So let me tell you where I land on this question. There is an organization, I urge you to look at their website, California Forward. This is a nonpartisan, foundation-funded effort to take the concept of a constitutional convention but refine it, and refine it in this way. Instead of just opening it up wide open for a convention that, yes, could include rational changes to our finance system, but might also involve school prayer or abortion or any of the myriad of social issues that are part of our 160-year California Constitution. What California Forward instead is doing is they're working with the legislature and working with the interest groups on the outside and working with some of the best thinkers to actually put forward a concrete systemic reform proposal for the voters. And they're going to bring it to us, and they're going to ask us to put it on the ballot, and it'll require a 2/3 vote to put it on the ballot. And if we don't, for the reason I mentioned a moment ago, they will then gather the signatures to put the measure on the ballot. And it is everything from changing the 2/3 vote for the state budget to creating what I call a healthy divorce between state government, local government, and school districts. Since Prop 13 passed 31 years ago, we are excessively entangled. The state raises the money, But really what we do is we pass the money on to local government, cities and counties. They don't have the authority to raise revenue, even though they're the ones closest to the people. And then they get mad at us because we don't send them as much money as they would like when we hit tough times. So I am looking very seriously at California Forward because it's reform, but not so open-ended. It suggests the possibility of being able to actually put specific ideas on the ballot for an up or down vote. I think that represents the best chance for change. Next question.
Let us go through just quickly some of the other issues that will come up, or may come up in a constitutional convention, and there have been some questions asked them. But term limits, redistricting, campaign finance.
Sure. Term limits. I spoke about that a moment ago. And that I'll be candid with you. I think the only way we change term limits in this state is to not include existing office holders. My generation is going to have to sacrifice for the next generation and say to the people, no self-interest here. We just want to do this for the future, and my term limit will be what it is, which is another 5 years, which is probably all I can handle anyways. So it may just work out fine. But I think that's the only way that we take ourselves out of the equation, but suggest for the next cohort of elected officials in the Senate and the Assembly, the term limits ought to be extended. I don't think we'll ever eliminate them, but at a minimum, you ought to have the ability to serve 12 years in any one house. That would create more sustained leadership. I mean, I have the chance to serve 6 years as pro tem. You know, my colleagues, I'm at will with my Democratic colleagues. But in the state assembly, with one exception, they've turned over speakers every 2 years. It's not enough time. So that's term limits. Redistricting. The voters passed Proposition 11, which hands legislative redistricting over to an independent citizens commission. I am hopeful that it will result in a couple of additional moderate members, especially moderate Republicans, who are willing to deviate from the anti-tax orthodoxy so that we can have a balance between spending and taxes that are fair. Remember our biggest dilemma. We say this: Barack Obama has a much harder job than I do. Stipulated, okay? However, he has one advantage that I don't have. They print money in Washington. It's really true. I mean, you don't read that much about the $1.5 trillion federal budget deficit. It'll all work out okay if the economy recovers and we get health care and all that, and I think he's doing a great job. In California, we're prohibited constitutionally from deficit spending. You either raise taxes or you cut expenditures. So redistricting may hold out the possibility of a couple more moderates so that when we face a $15 billion budget deficit, it can be half and half, as opposed to it all falling on the University of California and the working families who have to somehow figure out a way to pay the fee increases, which are just a tax increase by another name. That's redistricting. What was the third?
Campaign finance.
Campaign finance. Given a lot of thought about campaign finance, and here's the truth. In California, the voters have actually passed a number of campaign finance reform measures. A special interest now can only give a state senator $3,600. That seems like a lot, but it's actually relative. $3,600 for his or her campaign, and to run a competitive state Senate campaign, it can cost $1 million or $2 million. So you might think that has been a highly successful reform, and it hasn't. And here's why. The same group that can only give $3,600 to the candidate can, and in fact often do, form independent expenditure committees outside of the candidate's control, wink, wink, outside of the candidate's control, and there has to be that legal distance, and they can spend millions of dollars on behalf of the candidate or against a candidate. And so we haven't really taken money out of politics. And so to me, there are only two answers. One is to come to grips that if you really want a level playing field, there needs to be some piece of public financing. And yet, in this environment where we're running huge deficits and we're having a hard time funding education and healthcare and public safety, it's not a very popular thing to say taxpayer fund political campaigns. The federal government has done it in presidential elections with a voluntary checkoff. Maybe that's something that we can do here. But the other answer, the Supreme Court needs to revisit the famous constitutional case of Buckley v. Vallejo, because what the Supreme Court has said is that political speech is free speech, and that money spent on behalf or against a political candidate or a cause is protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution. So we can't restrict spending. We can restrict contributions, but we can't restrict spending. Public financing, revisiting Buckley v. Vallejo. Easy. Not really. In the meantime, I really believe that you earn your bones as a politician when you can look your biggest contributor in the eye or your biggest ally and say, "I'm sorry, on this one, I disagree with you, and I'm going the other way." And I'm proud to say, in my position as pro tem especially, and especially in this environment, I've done that a whole lot more than I ever thought I would. But that's why politics is a tough business. But it's what you have to do if you're gonna be in it, if you're gonna be a long timer.
You're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program. We're talking with Darrell Steinberg, President Pro Tem of the California State Senate, about the political stalemate and budget crisis in Sacramento. Darrell, we have a number of questions on specific issues, and maybe we'll just go through those. Several had to do with you talked about the water plan that you're engaged in currently. One question says, "What problem or problems will a peripheral canal solve?" And another has AB 32 or SB 375 made a tangible impact in Walnut Creek or Lafayette? And has any project actually been built, and is progress on climate change keeping up with the change in the climate? Maybe you could tell us what AB 32 and SB 375 are.
Well, AB 32 is the landmark climate change legislation passed in 2006. I was out of the legislature at the time. Maybe that's why it passed, I'm not sure. And it commits California to I believe it's a 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020. And it empowers the Air Resources Board to devise the series of strategies to meet that mandate. And it is still in its infancy. And the Air Resources Board have passed a number of regulations, especially on the automobile side, to begin implementation. But I think it is too early at this point to call it a success or not. It is ambitious. It is being looked at by not only this country, but the world. And it's the right goal. The question is, how do we get there? On SB 375, the law is less than a year old. And all of the regions of the state, even those that oppose the bill, are actively engaged in the process to begin developing regional plans that will result in more compact development. What do I mean by more compact development? Up instead of out. Retail, housing, commercial built closer to each other so that people can either walk, or if they drive, they're in their car for a shorter period of time. We call it a reduction in vehicle miles traveled. That's the parlance. In order to make land use and transportation part of the AB 32 solution, but too early. But I can tell you in your area this year, I was involved in a significant issue related to AB 32. During the budget, the governor asked us to overturn the California Environmental Quality Act, and specifically a lawsuit around the Caldecott Tunnel issue. And so I was able to convene the parties into my office to say, I don't want to overturn an existing lawsuit here, but maybe the parties can settle. And the result was a settlement that allows the Caldecott project to move forward, provide some mitigation for the nearby schools, but we essentially saved 3 years of what would have been a 3-year delay, by settling the case. So in a practical way, these laws do work. And that is another example of how sometimes it doesn't always get the press or the publicity, but every day we are up there, most of us, about trying to solve real problems.
There are a number of questions relating to education, both higher education and K-12. Most of them lamenting the fact that California used to have one of the best education systems in the country and that achievement seems to be going down. Could you talk about that, both higher education and K-12?
Sure. Money is not everything, but you better believe it makes a difference. And when California spends more money on its correction system, on its penal system, than we do on higher education, you know something is wrong. And this is what has been so troubling about the last year, the last several years, and one of the reasons why reform of this system is so essential. Because on the one hand, you can overtax people in a way that does in fact stifle business growth and economic growth. But when you read the surveys where businesses say, what are the single biggest factors that attract you to a certain state or certain place? You know what's number one? It's K-12 education and it's higher education. And we are doing a disservice by cutting in the way that we're cutting. I mean, the UC has always been a bargain. And I suppose if you compare the University of California at Berkeley to the tuition at USC or at Stanford or one of the private institutions, it's still a bargain, but not by much. And we're increasingly squeezing a lot of middle-class kids out who don't qualify for the kind of financial aid that they would need, and yet who can't afford what it takes. And at the same time, we're squeezing kids at the community college level too, which is the alternative, at least in the first 2 years. So money matters. But it's not just money, because I think the public has rightfully said that they want to know that if they grant more money, that it is actually going to lead to better results. And I look at our high school system, for example, and while it may work for a lot of kids in a lot of areas of the state, we have a 21% dropout rate. And an even higher percentage for African American and Latino kids. And not every young person is going to go to four-year college right away. They all ought to have the right and the opportunity. But what are we doing to change the paradigm of what secondary education means in this state and in this country? You know, it's based on an old ag model where 6, 7 periods, 8 to 3, get out of school so you can go help the family. How about making career education the rule rather than the exception? And beginning to instill in young people as early as the 8th and 9th grade the excitement and the possibility around the relationship between the boring subject that they're having to learn and what it might mean for them in terms of a high-wage job in the future. We have to do a lot better. And we have to look at where we have fallen down when it comes to education performance. So reform and resources. Reform and resources, all tied to the broader systemic reform of allowing there to be a more reasonable debate about what people want, or at least what people say they want, and how we go about paying for it.
You mentioned that we spend more on prisons than we do on the University of California, and one of the members of the audience has asked, what can we do to reduce our prison budget and increase our education budget?
Well, we made actually a significant stride. It was one of the victories in an otherwise difficult year this year. We cut over $1 billion of the state prison budget, and we accomplished that savings by actually successfully pushing forward a major parole reform in this state. Now the prisons are a revolving door. Guy gets out on parole, if he's busted for even a relatively minor offense, he goes back in to the most expensive housing, secured housing that we have in this state. So what we did was we said that even though it is imperfect, we have to do a better job of distinguishing between those who have a history and propensity for violence and those who don't. And if someone is out on parole and they don't have that history, then we will have less supervision, frankly, and save a lot of money. On the other hand, currently parole officers in this state have a caseload, an average caseload of 70 parolees. We're going to reduce that caseload to 45. But we're going to make sure that the 45 are the people who are most in need of supervision and save a lot of money along the way. So we made a big stride, but we didn't do quite enough. The Senate passed a bill to establish a public safety commission, otherwise known as a sentencing commission, with teeth. Because inside the legislature, it's next to impossible to reduce a prison sentence. And, my view is pretty basic. If you commit a violent act, that'll put you away if you hurt somebody. But if you're a drug offender or you're living with mental illness and you don't have that history for violence, we can be much more effective in reducing recidivism and much more cost-effective by investing in alternatives. But the only way to get at that is to have an independent entity look at the sentencing structure and make sure that we up the sentences if necessary for the violent folks, but don't incarcerate all the drug offenders. Find another way. That was defeated. The Sentencing Commission was defeated, and we need to come back and get at that again. So we've taken a step. Not nearly enough, but we've taken a step.
We have a number of questions on health care, beginning with how do you think that California will be affected by Obama's health care bill? And then it goes on, there are a number of questions relating to whether or not California might pass a health care bill of its own that would guarantee universal coverage.
I'm relatively optimistic about the prospects for health care reform in Washington, D.C. I think what came out of the Senate Finance Committee at least shows that there is a formula and a bill that in fact could work and gain moderate Republican support as well as mainstream Democratic support. But here's what worries me. Two things. The idea of an individual mandate where everybody's required to buy insurance is a good idea in theory. But if you're going to mandate that people buy insurance and you're not going to have cost controls, then what are you going to do for the working family, say, who, family of four that makes $40,000 to $50,000 to $60,000 a year, who simply cannot afford the coverage? And so how are you going to pay for the subsidies that are necessary to make sure people can afford the insurance when you are saying that it essentially has to be deficit neutral, and you're not putting any cost controls on the price of insurance? And that's where this public option debate comes in. And this, God, I did it again. And this leads to the answer to the question. The public option is important because it is one way to sort of create more competition to try to bring down the cost of health insurance. But I don't think he's going to get it. I think what he's probably going to get at the end is a state option, or a so-called trigger that would allow states or even the federal government to do a public option after a certain period of time. If it is a state option, then it's going to be on us to try to devise a public plan that could serve as a counterweight. And then we'll run headlong into the same ideological and philosophical debates that are going on in Washington, D.C. right now. The other fear and concern I have about what's going on in Washington is that to pay for the mandate, even if the subsidies are limited, that the Congress is going to choose, I'm not saying they're going to do this, I just fear this, that they're going to choose to significantly reduce federal assistance to the states, whether in the form of, assistance to hospitals or Medicare or Medicaid. And so it'll be kind of like robbing Peter to pay Paul. We can't afford, frankly, to take another $1 billion to $2 billion hit in our state budget. So it's reflective of what maybe the core of the problem here is in the state and in the country. We all want a lot of things, but we don't really connect what we say we want with an enthusiasm or even a willingness to figure out how we're going to pay for them. It's reflected in the field poll. You saw the field poll last week? Jerry and I were talking about it earlier. The public says the following: we want fundamental change. Change this broken system. So then you go through every category: term limits, the 2/3, all the things we've talked about here tonight. They are uniformly negative about every one of them. And that follows on a field poll of a few months ago when we were in the midst of the budget, where the public said, do not raise taxes, cut spending. And then you go through every category of spending that the state is responsible for, and with the exception of parks and recreation, they said, do not cut the following. No, I'm not looking for sympathy here. A little would be nice, but it is about us and our performing in a much more effective way and showing we can solve problems. But you know what? It's also about the people looking in the mirror as well and saying, what do we want? What do we want here? And to be consistent about that.
We have a question on transportation. Will public transportation continue to move forward in California, and can we stay on track with a high-speed rail between San Francisco and Los Angeles?
Good news and bad news. High-speed rail is really taking off. Not only did the voters in the midst of the recession approve a $10 billion bond to begin building the first leg of high-speed rail from San Francisco to Los Angeles, but the president has made high-speed rail a major national priority, and in the next couple of weeks, I expect you will read that we have been awarded another multi-billion-dollar grant to go with the $10 billion that the voters approved, and we are on our way. At the same time, it's rather ironic, because the bad news is we're starving our existing transit system, especially on the operating side. As part of the budget, again, I'm not happy about it. It's just a fact. Choice was in-home supportive services, children's health care, or state aid to transit agencies. And you know what? We did a little bit, frankly, a lot of all of it, given the $60 billion plus number that I just mentioned. And transit took a big hit. Now, last week or 2 weeks ago, Supreme Court decided that the hit was illegal. So the transit agencies will get all the money back, which is great for transit and provides another probably multi-billion-dollar hole in the state budget. So I don't know, are we doing well by transit? I think everyone recognizes that it is an essential component of our climate change strategy, of reducing congestion, and of helping maintain the quality of life in our communities. I know this. My daughter just started high school, and she's going to a public high school that is about 20 miles from our home. So we took the big leap and we bought her a transit pass. Every morning she gets on that bus, and it's a great, great thing, right? It creates independence. It creates mobility, the ability to get around. So I'm a big fan, but it's another issue that's caught up in the larger issue of our difficult fiscal situation.
You're listening to the Commonwealth Club of California radio program. We're talking with Darrell Steinberg, President Pro Tem of the California Senate, about the political stalemate and budget crisis in Sacramento. We've had a question about what we can do to decrease the gap between the rich and the poor in California.
Well, I know I did my part in 2004 when I led the ballot measure, Proposition 63, to impose a 1% tax on earnings over $1 million to pay for community mental health in this state. And it's generated billions of dollars of new funding for mental health. Fortunately, it's supplanted a lot of the funding that we've had to cut from the base budget, but thank God it's there. It's an interesting question because I believe in a progressive income tax. But the fact of the matter is, one of the reasons why we have the problems we do is that 1% of California taxpayers account for 50% of the revenue we receive. So we are overly reliant on high-income earners. And, it's not a stretch to say, as goes Google, so goes the state budget. So you're torn between two values. One, believing in progressive income tax, but on the other hand, recognizing that to some degree we have to broaden the base and flatten it out a little bit if we're going to have more stability and less volatility in our system. And that's another issue which we have to take on and take very seriously over the next year and years.
You mentioned, Darrell, or alluded to the unpopularity of the legislature. We have a number of questions which reflect that. One, some ask,
time to leave.
Whether the legislature actually does any good. Should we throw them all out of office? Do we need a part-time legislature? Why do you think people are so anti-government or anti-legislative? I mean, this isn't just the California legislature. Obviously, it's true across the country. It's true with people's feelings about Washington. What's going on?
Boy, I mean, you look at Congress. I mean, I was sort of perplexed, half upset, half relieved when I saw the approval ratings for Congress in California. I mean, they were a little higher than the legislature, but not much. I mean, I think there are a number of things. I do think that these are very difficult times for people. And we're not exactly delivering good news. When we cut $40 billion worth of public services or raise taxes in a limited way as we did in February, who are you making happy? I mean, it's all negative. Necessary, given, the context, but not good news. And, we tend to get kind of government-centric here, too. It's not about me. It's not about us. It's about what's happening to people in their lives, and people are having a hard time in their lives. 12% unemployment and rising, and people struggling economically, the highest rate of foreclosures. I mean, and so when you combine that with the fact that the institutions of government are not as responsive as they and we need to be in order to help people, it's not a surprise to me. And I don't put it all on the legislature, and I know I'm biased because I do think that there is this contradiction between what people say they want and the willingness to, step out and either change the way they do things or to pay more or to do differently. But the fact of the matter is, they elect us to try to produce, you elect us to try to produce on your behalf, and we need to do a better job producing on your behalf, period. So I want to get water done because it is a crucial issue for the future of California. The Delta is, it may seem esoteric, but if it collapses, you're going to feel it. We will all feel it. And beyond that, I want to be part of helping to show that representative government in California can actually begin working again. And so that's the only antidote to this thing, is doing better and producing and changing what we know is broken. And I own that. And we've got to be about doing it. We just, some of us just ask, if we can be judged maybe a little bit over the long term so that we have, some time to actually show that it can work.
There are a number of questions relating to this sort of limiting of the that things are going to hell, if you excuse the term, and that they're not as good as they used to be, and that the economy is going down. One questioner asked specifically what we can do to rebuild the California economy. Suggests that during the mythical brown years, that California benefited from large national subsidies during the Cold War. And what can we do now to strengthen the tax base and rebuild the economy without those national subsidies?
Well, I do think that it does help to have an active national partner. I mean, and healthcare is a great example, because we tried 2 years ago to do what the federal government is seeking to do now, and one of the big problems was we knew we had to provide the subsidies for the mandate, and the moment we were about to vote, we found out that the deficit was ballooning to $15 or $16 billion. You need a federal partner, so that's one. But in the broader sense, people ask me all the time, so what's your biggest priority? What's the agenda? How do you get out front? And to me, the overriding agenda for our time is linking education in a more direct and profound way with the new economy. We silo ourselves. We've got the education system. We've got the healthcare system. And then we've got the department that works on economic development. The problem is that they all need to be working together. Look at healthcare. As we expand access, we're going to have a huge need to increase the healthcare workforce. Not just doctors, but nurses and social workers and nursing assistants and phlebotomists, and go on and on and on and on. What are we doing to change our education system to make sure that that 10th grader who will likely become a dropout statistic is actually being educated and trained for a middle class or better job in the healthcare industry? And I could say the same about the other 5 leading economic growth areas in our state. Look at the green economy. We all talk about green jobs like they're going to appear mythically. What are we doing to connect our education system with the skills and education and training that are going to be necessary for the next generation to hold those jobs? That's the challenge of our time, and it cross-cuts across all of the issues. And that's the way we rebuild our economy. We make education, but in a more intelligent way. Again, our priority. Every politician says, hey, I'm for education. More money for education. I say we go a little bit deeper than that. And we make a commitment. For example, I'll give you this example. We give billions of dollars in business tax credits, and nobody really knows whether or not they're really creating jobs. We don't know, for example, whether or not it was the tax credit that created the job or something else. And I'm a big skeptic, but I know this. I'd be very happy to give tax credits to businesses in each of these sectors with one condition, that the industry partners with our public education system to create pathways for young people who are going to be the key to our economy going forward. That's a positive agenda. I can't wait to actually start working on it and not just deal with crisis.
Unfortunately, we reached the point in our program where there's time for one last question. What are your thoughts on the upcoming governor's race, and do any of the candidates have any serious proposals to deal with the budget problem?
What do I think of the upcoming governor's race? There will, in fact, be a governor's race next year. I would just like to be very clear on that. Well, I think it is one of those races that be careful to be too bold in your prediction too early. You know, remember, who was that senator from Illinois who had been in the state senate back in 2003 and 2004, and who Hillary Clinton was going to beat soundly? It's very, very fluid. And I don't think any of them, frankly, have caught fire. I mean, Gavin Newsom is a charismatic guy who I think has established a great record in San Francisco. Jerry Brown, what I've learned about Jerry Brown is that he may have been governor, 25 years ago? He has not lost his contacts throughout the state of California. I mean, he is well known, not among the political community and also among the voters. And then on the Republican side, I don't know if you want to hear my answer, but Steve Poizner, I know. I think he's a gentleman, and he seems like a serious guy. He kind of has to pander to the right, to the right wing quite a bit. And I don't know Meg Whitman. I'm sure she's a fine person. Have not been impressed in the least with anything she has said about state government. It's just the easiest thing in the world to just be an outsider and to say, we'll cut 40,000 jobs here, we'll cut the budget by this. Ask Arnold Schwarzenegger, okay? Just ask him how easy all of that has been when you grapple with the real impact of some of these decisions. So, I just would appreciate a more serious approach to actually looking at the challenge and the balances that go into real governing. So I don't know what will happen. I think Jerry Brown's probably the favorite at this point. And we shall see what happens. That's why they have the elections,
Our thanks to Darrell Steinberg, President Pro Tem of the Cal State Senate, for his comments. And we also thank our audience here and on the radio. I'm Jerry Lubenow, and now this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, celebrating more than a century of enlightened discussion, is adjourned.